Bhindranwale preached a fiery message mixing religion and nationalism.
Religion and nationalism. Again, this is old coverage, so I don't expect it to be any good. Dig, Miri, Biri, Santaspai, these are all intertwined concepts within Sikhi. You can't separate like Dharam and politics. Politics have to be rooted and led and focused on Dharam. Raj, in the same sense, Raj will not be successful if it's not rooted in Dharam itself. But they are intertwined. Like you can't separate the two. So when they're talking about like mixing, it's just like, well, that's seen through like a Western lens, not our lens, obviously. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. In today's video, we're going to take a look at CBC's academic short on the Khalistan movement. This was roughly about a 13-minute video created by the CBC in conjunction with several academics, including Indra Prasht, Satwinder Bans, Harjeet Singh from University of Calgary, and Shinder Purewal. We decided to put this together because when we watched the original short, we found it to be heavily problematic from like a Panthic standpoint. And originally, like we recorded this video, this whole thing was drafted up ready to go last week. But after some review and looking at some of the other shorts that CBC came out with, we needed to add more context. And this is why you'll see kind of some flips in between this video and the previous recording. Because CBC's agenda became a bit more clear once we've watched the video about 7 or 8 times, but also seen some of the other stuff that they've come out with since then. So this video, we're predominantly going to look at and address 2 things. One is the way that CBC has framed the entire documentary or short. Then the other side as well too is kind of breaking up and myth busting a lot of the rhetoric that they've put into this, either from really historical footage, stuff that was from the 1980s, 1990s, and also some of the statements and comments made by the academics. To preface a little bit, it's important to understand that CBC knows what they're doing. Like things don't just happen by accident. Rhetoric doesn't happen by accident for sure. So when we look at this, and even when I look at it, I see it from 2 angles. I see CBC's put together a 10-minute short. They've condensed a lot of history into a very short period of time. And they've done it in a specific way to make our movement, make our cause look illegitimate or fundamentalist or frantic or just something that isn't really going to be taken seriously by the viewers that they're intending this for. And that's not because of anything that we've done. It's not our fault for something like that. It's because CBC has their own sort of agenda and mindset when it comes to these discussion. And so that kind of harks to the broader issue of media coverage within the Western diaspora, largely because there is a pre-colonial disposition and inherent level of racism when you have movements within the West, you have plights within the West that are taken seriously because they fit a Western model, because they fit a colonial model. And anything outside of that is seen as just not legit. Like it's not something that's taken seriously because it doesn't really fit the mold of what the West is. And so, yeah, let's go through it and take a look.
Topic of Khalistan is very complex, but the meaning, the land of the pure, is consistent.
Defining Khalistan in the diaspora is a bit complicated. I feel that we've decided that Khalistan is a separate state within the nation state of India that is run by people who are Khalsas, who are Sikhs.
For the Indian state, Khalistan movement is seen as a violent movement that threatens the territorial sovereignty of India.
It's always funny when I hear that because like getting the oppressor to define what Khalistan is always going to come up with like vitriol and aggressive language, because obviously view Khalistan in obviously like a nationalistic sense, and it's all about like protecting themselves, protectionism, and that sort of rhetoric. But it's just like, if India's sovereignty is dependent upon the genocide and oppression of Sikhs and other minorities as well too, then does it really deserve sovereignty or any sort of independence from anything else on its own?
It's an idea that has been developed over time, but that is steeped in history.
And when a government or an institution erases the history or tampers with religion, you will see resistance.
True.
There's different...
Okay, before we even get into this timeline, the fact that it starts here, like almost 100 years after the initiation of the Khalsa Panth and the formation of that martial aspect of our dharam is a bit of an indicator of how the rest of this is going to kind of play out. But I kind of rolled my eyes here that, you know, we're talking about Khalistan, but we're not talking about all the, like the Gurmat with it, all the entrenched history with our gurus and our shaheeds. And devil's advocate to my own point, like I don't expect academia to go that far into like dharam and philosophy and spirituality, but there's like massive nuance that's required with this discussion. So I feel like a little bit of work going into it in terms of kind of grabbing an earlier timeline would be a bit more of a better representation of like where Khalistan comes from, what it's about, what it's entrenched in, so on and so forth.
Points of the history which are significant. We can go as far back as the colonial period through Maharaja Ranjit Singh, a kingdom centered in the capital being Lahore.
Maharaja Singh is a tangible historical marker that plays a very important role in showing that actually there is a possibility of Sikh rule, successful Sikh rule.
Okay, this is the part that I rolled my eyes at. First, when Harjit was just like, you know, as far back, it's like, no, you can go a lot farther back than this. But I think that's Indra speaking in the back and talking about the possibility. And that's where I'm just like, Khalistan isn't possible because of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Raj. Khalistan is possible because of the culture that our gurus have set up, because of the shahidi given, the qurbani given, and because, you know, Badshah is a dawa, Raj is hukam. And our strength and our ability to pursue this through dharam is rooted in that. It's rooted in our guru, our guru's bani. It's not just found simply because Maharaja Ranjit Singh made it work. And I know there's going to be a ton of like discussion on how Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Raj was defined, Khalsa Raj or not Khalsa Raj. So be it. That's a different discussion for a different day. But like I wouldn't look at the possibility of Khalistan being a formalized, going from formalized concept to application because Maharaja Ranjit Singh made it work. My conviction within fighting for Khalistan, fighting for Raj, is stemmed in our Guru's teachings. And that goes all the way back to Sri Guru Nanak Dev Maharaj. It goes up to Sri Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj, Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, Bhai Taru Singh, Bhai Mani Singh, Baba Deep Singh. It goes, like, there's a long historical train when it comes down to this sort of thought. And this is where I'm just like, I rolled my eyes when this first one came out, and I'm just like, we're just going to start here.
But it wasn't until the British came when his empire crumbled. So I think people go back to that golden age and dream that that is something that we will get back, where we'll be autonomous, where we will know our boundaries.
One of the ways is talked about is to have that return to the Sikhs, right? What that looks like, as I mentioned, is debated.
Muslims were saying, we want out. We want our own country. We don't want to be ruled by the Hindus. And they were afforded East Pakistan and West Pakistan. Punjab was divided. 3/4 of Punjab went to Pakistan. 6 stayed with India.
In the 1940s, Khalistan was part of the discussion post-partition, and this was important because it led to questions concerning the Sikh identity, the Sikhs themselves not having a homeland.
In the new Punjab, they were.
That's where it's just like mad props to Indira Prasth, because a lot of the times when Khalistan is discussed, we talk about it in a post 1970 sort of sense, and a lot of people are just like, no one was ever talking about this before, but that's the honest truth. Like, the term Khalistan itself came out of like 1942, 1946, around there, just around the partition mark. That was the term that was used. That this wasn't like a post 1970 sort of ideal and concept. And then you can obviously go back further and you get into, you know, different terms, different definitions, but Badshahi and sovereignty have always been like a discussion point within our community.
Again, a minority.
After partition, I think
Point of
Punjabis
reference here.
and Sikhs thought that they did get the short end of the stick, because soon after that, as India developed as a nation state, there was a big stress on Punjab to feed the rest of India, because it was still a burgeoning population and very little food.
Punjab is the breadbasket feeding all of India, yet infrastructurally it was neglected. All of these really adversely affected the farmers, but also the social conditions of the institutions, the judiciary, the police.
This is setting the stage up for a feeling that Sikhs do not belong in the Indian nation state, and that there will be no equality, that they will be second-class citizens.
Sant Jarnel Bindranwale. The charismatic preacher was a leading proponent of a separate Sikh state named Khalistan.
Bindranwale preached a fiery message mixing.
Okay, so this is like the stuff that I grew up on. Like this report or this video doc, this is from like, God, I don't even know. This is probably maybe a little bit before the 2000s, but this is like some of like the narrative or misinformation that kind of came about. The topics of Khalistan came up within Santi's speeches a little bit later into like 82, 83, 84. But if you pay attention to his rhetoric and the stuff that he was talking about, he actually was quite neutral. I think most of his statements were along the lines of, if Indira Gandhi is willing to compromise and you know, put that on the table, then like Sikhs won't say no. But he obviously made definitive statements closer to the end of 1983, early 84, right before the operation, where he was just like, you know, if police and military decide to step foot on the Parikrama and try to raise Darbar Sahib, Sri Akal Takht Sahib, then Khalistan, the foundations of Khalistan will be laid. And he was very clear about that. But they're putting this mark at like 1980, giving the impression that he was trying to go at it right from the get-go, which just wasn't the case at all.
Bindranwale preached a fiery message mixing religion and nationalism.
Religion and nationalism. Again, this is old coverage, so I don't expect it to be any good. Dig, miri, biri, santaspai, these are all intertwined concepts within Sikhi. You can't separate like dharma and politics. Politics have to be rooted and led and focused on dharma. Raj in the same sense. Raj will not be successful if it's not rooted in dharma itself, but they are intertwined. Like, you can't separate the two. So when they're talking about like mixing, it's just like, well, that's seen through like a Western lens, not our lens, obviously.
Leaders are opposed to separatism, but now they say Bindranwale.
Yeah, so the thing here is like CBC's framing and cuts with this content, this older content, in between the academics really creates this sort of fusion between both pieces. Because on one side you have you know, a predisposition is already set within the viewer because of the initial rhetoric that CBC's put together. But then they keep intertwining this older footage with the academics. And so when a viewer looks at this, they assume, obviously, from, you know, what we kind of experience through society, that academics know what they're talking about. And so when you have this content right before that's filled with just state propaganda, and then an academic coming right after it, you tend to believe it, because it's like, why would an academic be a part of this if they knew that this other footage was inflammatory? And so this really harks to the bigger problem that CBC has basically full editorial control. So these interviews are done, these recordings are all done before the fact, and CBC comes in and smashes everything together. And, you know, potentially the academics don't align with that footage, but they don't have any say in it, and they don't have any ability to critique CBC in this kind of scenario. And CBC can basically curate whatever story that they want. And in this case, they're trying to keep setting this sort of narrative that the Khalistan movement and the Sikhs of that time were illegitimate and were creating a level of disharmony amongst the legitimate democracy that is India.
Death will make him a martyr.
I think the leaders that came forward, like Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, came out of a sense of resistance and unrest.
Okay, so Satwinder Vance does a really good job in general. And even here, like, I'm not taking a jab at her. I guess this is like, comes more from like the exposure to Jujaru culture, exposure to that history, more at like a Panthic level. But I wouldn't say that Santji came out as a prominent leader because of proclivity to resistance. I would say he came out because it's duty and obligation. One, obviously being the Jathedar of the Damdami Tiksad, that puts a responsibility on you, but also just responsibility to your Sikhi itself. When you see things like Singhs getting picked up and tortured, when you see Maharaj's Sarup being like found in buffalo manure, when you see all this stuff going on, it's not just like resistance to the state. It's your history, it's your culture. It's like you look back at like Taru Singh, Banda Singh Bahadur, you look back at the Gurus, you look back at all of the Shahidi given because of that conviction in Gurmat and that conviction in the culture that Maharaj has bestowed upon us. So again, this is probably me nitpicking more than anything else, but I do just want to clarify here that like the Khalistan movement and the main figures within the movement, main figures within the Dharam Yudh Morcha didn't just come out into action because of the state. It's because of their culture. The willingness and the desire to always fight against tyranny and oppression is the reason that they went out.
He would often say that, I'm not asking for Khalistan, but if Indira Gandhi's administration wants to give Sikhs Khalistan, and that's the way that Sikhs can become sovereign, then we'll take it.
He was actually a saint to begin with, simply asking for social reforms. On the other hand, he also created an aura that he could kill anyone.
Bhindranwale took up residence in the Golden.
I think that was Shinder. I didn't see the name, but the aura that he could kill anybody. I mean, if you're an Attavadi and you're doing like Nindya of the Guru and you're out here promoting communal violence, then yeah, there's a good understanding that you're probably going to be touched. But I don't know, I guess it's just his wording, it's just funny.
Temple. From his fortified sanctuary there, he presided over a ruthless campaign of bombing, sabotage, and assassination.
Again, state propaganda.
That claimed hundreds of lives.
Even Bhindranwale, who was obviously one of the most militant Sikh leaders, he mobilized a lot of Sikhs. All the, especially...
Most militant Sikh leader. Again, this guy's wording is just really kind of soaked in state propaganda, or at least state narrative. But yeah, I'm not going to waste too much time on this.
The Hindus, they get scared that you are targeting us. It leads to 1984 entry of the army in Golden Temple.
Jesus, what a shit jump this guy just made. So I think everybody will notice kind of as we go through this guy tends to just blurt out stuff without source or rhyme or reason. It's just, probably his own sort of anecdotes that he tends to rely on. But the whole thing about like Hindus wondering why you're targeting us, it's hard to unpack that when you don't know where the hell it's coming from, because there's so many instances, recorded instances with Santji, and like there's a story of the Hindu shopkeeper that Santji assisted rebuilding a shop, I believe, and providing him funds because of like some of the communal violence that broke out. There was the Hindu girl as well too that Santji took under in terms of like protection because her family was abusing her. He made a point all the time for Sikhs to understand that killing innocent people, any innocent person, is Bob. And I think what the problem is people, maybe like Shinder or even like state propagandists, don't see that line between who they are and Narankari Gurbachana or Lala Jagtanaran. They just view them as, or they're just seeing this at face value, where it's just like, oh, Ben Ranwal is putting a hit out on these guys or targeting these guys, therefore I'm in that range too. If you align yourself with those kind of people, then yeah, sure, you're in that range. But yeah, again, this whole thing about like him targeting Hindus and just being some sort of like genocidal maniac is really super unfounded and tends to be rooted in a bunch of anecdotes and garbage.
It took an entire battalion of Indian troops backed by tanks and rockets to storm the Sikh Golden Temple in Amritsar.
Bloodletting began in earnest on the 5th of June, 1984. Codenamed Operation Blue Star, the Indian Army, on orders from Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, attacked the Golden Temple.
So 1984 is a seminal moment in our history, because after the Golden Temple, which to us is a sacred site of worship and of religious history, was bombed attacked by the Indian government. It was sealed off. A lot of people died within it, pilgrims and others who were there at the time, innocent people.
The state narrative here is that this is meant to rout out terrorists or militants or fundamentalists who had come in to disrupt the sanctity of the temple precincts and who had refused to.
Okay, so this is like the prime example of CBC's really disingenuous framing here. Only Amritari professor, and he's the only one that's visibly Sikh. So for non-viewers, he would be seen as a legitimate voice for the Sikh community. And he's also perpetuating, I wouldn't say like willingly, they probably asked him in the original full recording to explain this, and they've taken out the sound bites that they needed in terms of state narrative talking points. So you have all this kind of build up, Sikhs creating disharmony. The Khalistan movement is very fringe. It's fundamentalist. It's almost like Khomeini sort of style to it. And then you have the Amritari professor come in, and he's just like, yeah, well, the state said, this, and this. And it further just reinforces the viewer to take that as truth. Because like, what else, how else are you going to view that? If someone comes in watching this and they don't have a genuine full understanding of the issue and the nuance with it that comes with the territory when you work in these Panthic sort of spaces, they're going to take everything here as predominantly fact. And so what you see in this case is they're going to look at Harjit Singh and say, oh, wow, I guess the Sikh community is really divided, and this is a super problematic issue, and the state must have been pretty much justified. But they don't talk about state atrocities. They don't talk about the violence or anything else like that occurred during the Jung itself. They're just, again, perpetuating this point that the Khalistan movement is illegitimate based off of the nitpicking and the framing that they're doing.
Used to leave despite many attempts to get them out.
You ask the Indian government's position is...
Okay, so Harjit is right on that. Like, that's state narrative. The state's narrative that they were pushing for almost 4+ years was, Sikh militants, Sikh militancy. These guys are problematic. They're provoking communal tensions. They're generating violence and grief. We had no other option. We had to take them out. and I think what they don't talk about here, and something I'm probably going to rip on Shinder for in a second, is they don't obviously discuss in this 10-minute short the promotion of communal violence by the state for over 4 years, which was a big catalyst for everything that's happening up into this point, right before Operation Blue Star. 1978 Narankari massacre was backed and funded by the state. Guru Bachana and the Narankari cult, back when Indira Gandhi was pushed out of power by the BJP, Akali Dal sort of joint force, got basically in touch with them, started backing them, funding them, and the police assisted in the Narankari massacre in April of 78. And that was just one instance. Then you go into like her right-hand mans, Gyani Zail Singh and Darbara Singh. On one side, you'd find them being behind severed cow heads at the steps of mandirs. You'd find Maharaj's Sarup found within like manure. You'd find tobacco thrown into the Sarovar at Darbar Sahib, people being caught for it. Kind of the same things that we deal with now, but these were all happening at a very tight time frame and close situation, in line with the state's agenda of creating this narrative that Punjab is basically like ruthless and lawless, and there's so much stuff going on, we have to intervene. And this is also in conjunction with the fact that any sort of peace discussion that was happening between the Akali Dal and Congress and Indira Gandhi, all of it was being filibustered. And this is recorded history. This isn't like me spitting off some stuff. You can find this within, I believe it's Kushwant Singh's Sikh History Volume 1 or 2, where they talk about how the Indian state, quote unquote, didn't want to give an inkling of thought to the Akali Dal that there's any sort of resolution going to come out of these meetings. And I think it was like 13 to 14 peace meetings were filibustered. On top of that, you also have Santji was able to freely move around, going down to Mumbai and Haryana and stuff like that. And on multiple occasions, police were just like, okay, we're ready to take them. Like we have them in our sights. We have this ready to go. And per state directive, they were told to stand down. And then when Santji was arrested, he was also let go again by state orders, because the whole thing was, if you simmer down the morcha, if you slow it down and solve it, quote unquote, you're not going to have this big sort of outcome that Indira Gandhi wanted, which was to break the backs of Sikhs. So, yeah. Let's see what he has to say now.
There were a lot of terrorists who had moved in Golden Temple.
Until this week, the Golden Temple was the one place Mrs. Gandhi had not dared challenge the Sikh militants. But the assassination of 2 Hindu politicians in May was the last straw. 6 days ago, Mrs. Gandhi sent tens of thousands of soldiers into the Punjab for a showdown with Bhindranwale.
Okay, so again, this is old footage, which is why this is being said. Everyone has to understand that it wasn't just like Santji's Morcha, the Dharam Yodh Morcha that was going on at this time. It was also the Akali Dal Morcha that was going on from like 1973, 74, technically during Indira Gandhi's emergency rule, all the way up to kind of this point. Now, there's waves, obviously, with the Morcha itself, but yeah, like the Akali Dal was having their sort of like protest going on. Things shifted when it was highlighted that the Akali Dal wasn't actually doing anything later on, when things were getting pretty exasperated. But this idea that Indira Gandhi sent in troops because 2 MPs were killed is just a load of shit. The main driving factor, I think, is Longowal announced a big stop movement around June 6th, where basically they were going to stop all taxes, all crops, all rail. Basically, they were going to shut down everything kind of going out of Punjab. And the context that everyone needs to understand at this time is Punjab was relied upon heavily during the Green Revolution in the 60s, even till now, for food production, because India itself wasn't super great at maintaining their own sort of like commodity in terms of crop and agriculture. They relied on Punjab heavily to feed basically the rest of Punjab. So having like a food stoppage and tax stoppage and all this kind of stuff, that would have been a huge slap in the face to the state. So I know people will debate this for sure, and some people will be like, yeah, for sure it's the MPs, which I call BS on. To me, it's that sort of kind of like what they said, it's like that showdown, but that the showdown is not just with Santji, the showdown's with the Sikh Panth against the state, and it just would have looked bad on Indira's part to basically keep allowing this to go on, so she came in and did what she did.
Group is blamed for not leaving, and the blame is squarely put on them for the attack and the devastation.
It should be noted here, though, that one, the plans to attack were made in 82, well before Santji was actually in the Darbar Sahib complex, and also before it was fortified. So the idea to attack was way before. So Indira thought about it. She also received black op plans from the SAS, British SAS, on how to extract Santji with like maybe a 10-man team. They denied that. They didn't want to go and do with it. And then December of 83, Santji moved into the direct complex. So I believe he was staying in Sri Guru Ramdas Saran for the past 3 years, so he wasn't directly in. December of 83, he moved in, and then the fortifications began around April, May. So the time frame was very tight for when this whole quote-unquote militancy, or at least this specific militancy, was showing up. But again, yeah, state narrative is going to be state narrative.
The guns and weapons. Now, who supplied him the guns? That's a $1 million question.
$1 million question. Yeah, they were sourced through Pakistan and China. Like, they had things that would just procure those weapons and move things over. And having weapons in Darbar Sahib is not a bad thing. It's just made out to be bad because minorities and Sikhs and other people that are on the other end of the table of oppression, them having any sort of equivalency of power or tool of power is seen as bad. But the state can do it all day long. The state can commit genocide. The state can have violence. The state can have weapons and nuclear arms and all that kind of stuff. You'll never hear anything about it. But the second a minority does, yeah, it's bad. Shinder owes me $1 million.
Indranwale died in a hail of bullets, along with as many as 500 of his supporters.
So what happens over that week is difficult to discern, partly because of the amount of misinformation, but thousands of Sikhs lose their lives.
It wasn't just Darbar Sahib that was attacked. It was 40 plus other Gurdwara around Punjab that were also stormed at the same time. And it wasn't just the military operation. Like, these guys went out of their way to kill babies, kill women, kill bujurgs. They went out of their way to burn the Sikh reference library, despite the fact that the Jung was over. This was like June, I think it was like 7 or 8. It was just a bit after they burnt it to the ground, despite nothing requiring that, quote unquote. They desecrated bodies. General Shahbeg Singh Ji, Shaheed General Shahbeg Singh Ji, his body was brought down to the basement of the Akal Takht. He spoke with Santji for his last little bit and attained Shahidi there from wounds. His body was dragged from the basement to the Prakarma, the main grade level. He had wire wrapped around his legs, wire wrapped around his hands, his wrist, around his back. His scalp was removed, his geas was cut. He had an iron rod protruding out of his rib cage. These are photos that you can see. I think it's on sikhmuseum.com. So I don't want anybody thinking for a second that this was just like some necessary sort of like operation. They went out of their way to do as much collateral damage as they could get away with, which was Indira's goal completely in the first place.
Shops and businesses all over the country closed their doors and Indians crowded into the streets. But the shock soon gave way to anger. The 66-year-old Prime Minister was the victim of gunmen identified as Sikh extremists. Her murder, the apparent culmination of a 2-year campaign of terror for the creation of an independent Sikh state.
And immediately the first news that comes out is that 2 Sikh bodyguards have killed her.
This is quickly afterwards followed by the assassination of Indira Gandhi, seen as a retribution killing. And then several days of attacking, killing, maiming, raping, and torturing Sikhs. in the capital in Delhi.
There was the systematic interrogation and arrests of Sikh youth. So it was literally almost like cleaning out.
So just a little bit before about what Harjit Singh was saying, it wasn't just the mobs, like everybody needs to understand. It was the state and the police and the army that were all complicit with it. There's so many stories of families having cops enter their house and being like, you know, just give us your weapons and we'll make sure that everything's okay. We just want to make sure like no one's fighting. And then the second they leave, mobs would come in. And Congress supported bringing in mobs from outside the Delhi area to come in and just create havoc. And yeah, again, this isn't like mob violence alone, or it wasn't just like riots, like how they like to say. It was full, planned, straight out genocide. They wanted to wipe Sikhs from Delhi.
Parts of India.
Really grotesque violence. Mothers who were raped, in front of their sons, and then killed, only to have the daughter raped before the father and brother.
So again, this is like another problematic sort of framing by CBC. So up to this point, just focusing on Harjit Singh, they've built up again this rhetoric that you have a small fundamentalist population that's spearheading this movement. And then you have a huge majority of Sikhs who probably don't align with this, quote unquote. And Harjit is really being framed as the representative of this majority that doesn't really align with it based off of how they're chopping up his footage. So like first he was regurgitating state talking points. Then now he's creating this sort of like victimhood complex, this sense of you should feel sorry for him. And what that does is the viewer again looks at it and they're like, wow, this fundamentalist small population that was leading this movement really screwed over the rest of the community that just wanted peace, democracy, love, and all that kind of stuff. And again, they're going to look at this and they're going to take this all for fact because of the person who's saying it, which is an Amritari professor that CBC's cherry-picked and really have done a disingenuous job at explaining the entire story because of their own proclivities and biases.
What happens in India from now on will have tremendous impact on whether tensions continue to mount in Canada. Rajiv Gandhi was not able to prevent the massacre of Sikhs after his mother's death.
No, he fully promoted it. So again, this propaganda should be kind of checked where it is. Yeah, the entire freaking family basically was pro-Sikh genocide.
The picture tells the horror, but many people suspect the whole story is not being told.
The commissions that have read that time and have written reports on that time say that government was involved, police was involved. You know, the Sikhs have never forgiven India for that.
The discourse around it has been controlled to a great degree by India, which certainly sees it as a terrorist movement. Why? Because of some elements within the movement who have been attracted to the acquisition of arms, militarized training, and militant behavior.
Yeah, but then you're going to have to go and like nitpick on all of our Sikh history then. Like this whole thing about attraction to weapons, attraction to violence. Like our Bani is filled with Shastras, Jung, Bhakti. Like it's a broad blend of all of it. But so is our history. Like if you're going to nitpick on the 1980s for proclivities to violence and weapons, then you're going to also have to complain about like the missile period, the jungs that the gurus were involved in, and like all the Kali Babur movements and Morche led during the British occupation. Like no one complains that Sikhs were violent during the British occupation, but the second that control by Bipran ideology of India itself, then violence is bad.
However, there are many parts of it that are not linked to violence or militancy, but rather to the autonomy of the Punjab, the economic development of the Punjab.
This is the biggest problem in studying the Khalistan movement, is what is truth, what is fact. After 1984, it was a violent confrontation on both sides.
The one thing I'll note here is like they jump right into Air India, which like they're going to talk about this in a bit, but it's like, okay, violent confrontation. You could have talked about 86. You could have talked about Black Thunder 1 and 2. You could talk about the Sangharsh itself. But like everyone tends to come back to this one point as if it's the be all and end all of what Khalistan is. And that this is like the primal indicator of what Khalistan is, but it isn't. It's just what tends to be thrown into the media cycle for just increased vilification of an entire movement.
Then the Air India bombing happens.
Air India Flight 182, bound for New Delhi, explodes off the coast of Ireland.
Air India was one of the biggest acts of terrorism in our Canadian history, which, you know, unfortunately, so many Canadians don't really understand or know about.
329 people are killed.
This is where Tahir Sadiq came to learn that, yes, indeed, his mother was dead.
Her name was Sugra Sadiq, age 65, a retired doctor going home for a visit.
My mother.
On June 23rd every year, I hear from people who've lost their classmates, their colleagues, friends from the neighborhood. You know, there's so many people who've been touched by this tragedy, and there's been no justice for their loved ones, for our loved ones.
So that really festered in people a wound that I think has not ever again been really has not healed because there's been no resolution.
The issue has been who's responsible.
We don't know who did it, but it was linked to the movement of Khalistan.
And I would argue that the activism in Canada is unique and distinct because of Air India. And it has impacted identity formation for many Sikh men in particular, who now feel that they feel a violent gaze conferred onto their turban.
Okay, so the one thing I'll say here is, and this is just like, again, a clarification for people that may not fully understand the nuance in the activism here within the diaspora. There are people that genuinely just don't support Dalvinder Singh Parmar, and there are people that do support him. And to clarify on the position of support, those that do back him don't do so because they think that he did the bombing itself or he was involved in the bombing. They feel that he was framed for this attack and he wasn't involved, and he was killed and was picked up by police, I believe, when he went back to Punjab, and killed in an extrajudicial fashion as kind of a, you know, the state saying that, yeah, we can touch you sort of thing. But again, this isn't like the Sikh community here that does support him backs him because he did the attack. They believe that he didn't. And yeah, I see all this rhetoric tend to come up within like Sangis and people down here as well too, the domestic population, where they're like, you know, why do you guys have you know, pictures of Parmar up at the Gurdwara, or why do you have this and that? And they associate that directly with like diasporic Sikhs here being pro Air India bombing, which they aren't. Like I was hard pressed to find anybody that had any sort of inclination of support of that. And I've never come across anybody yet in my years of like outreach and activism that does support it. Everyone that I've talked to that backs Parmar backs him because they believe he wasn't involved and that he was a shaheed.
The chants make it clear what this was all about. A call for an independent Sikh state known as Khalistan.
Hundreds of community members and supporters of the Khalistan movement came together.
all to commemorate the life of Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
Outside of a certain range of flashpoints in the Punjab, broadly speaking, in India, Khalistan is not a major issue.
Again, CBC trying to further reinforce that you can kind of shrink support for Khalistan down to a very small group, further emphasizing that there isn't really any support for it and really providing zero rationale or context behind it. And again, CBC has done this specifically to further marginalize the Sikh and the Khalistani community by showcasing it over and over and over throughout this 10-minute short that we are fringe, we are like very minute, we're a very small quote unquote problem that's created big ripples. So that's why we deserved whatever we got.
The context, I think, of Sikhs broadly is also relevant. It's about 1.5 to 2% of the Indian population. India is a vast entity with almost 1.5 billion people.
Quite interestingly, the movement is only in diaspora. In Punjab, you don't see this movement.
Shinder's a freaking idiot for this one because it doesn't take much effort to really look into the Morcha itself in Punjab, in the diaspora, to understand that it's not just in the diaspora itself. You see this tend to come out here the most because you won't be shot and killed for advocating for Khalistan. You won't be shot and killed for speaking your mind in the diaspora. Relative to Punjab, which had 20 to 30 years plus of just violence and genocide and murder, and you think that people are just going to be as open to having these sort of conversations as they would anywhere else. Like, I see this all the time, again, with people on Twitter or people like Shinder here saying that, oh, well, you know, the Khalistan movement is just isolated to the diaspora. And it's just like, you can look at the Kisan Morcha, you can look at Dal Khalsa in Punjab right now, you can see these conversations happening, you can see activism swirling and stuff like that. Just because it doesn't show in the same way that it does here doesn't mean that it's non-existent. And this idea that like you can still take the current view of Punjab in terms of activist discussion in context of 40 plus years or 20 plus years of violence and think that things are just going to roll the same way as before, that's just not the case. So this is just a really shit take by Shinder once again.
Khalistan is always changing in terms of how it's being envisioned by the next generation. And so the Sikh diaspora today in Canada, in England, in America, in Australia are questioning identity, and their identity is formed around the activism confronting inequality.
We live in this global context where this is a festering wound, if you want to think of it. The term Khalistan is one of the ways that people can express this frustration.
Contemporary ideas of Khalistan continue to be fraught with difficulty, with polarization, with people on one side or the other. But I think if greater minds came together, perhaps at a round table or a discussion, perhaps we can understand the past so we can create a better future, if that is the future we want.
So this last part really wraps it up nicely for what CBC's whole agenda is with this. They flop between three academics, all basically insinuating that there is no real concrete foundation to what Khalistan is based off of their academic perspective. So they're only looking at this from, socioeconomics, from a political standpoint, but they don't understand that the fundamental basis to Khalistan has never changed. And that is rooted in Gurmat, it's rooted in Badshah, it's rooted in the very essence of the Sikh requirement of fighting oppression. So what CBC's done here is just basically, again, further reinforce to the viewer that, the Khalistan movement is not really legitimate. It's very small. The because of their extremist and militant actions, the state did what it had to do. But this kind of lingers on in the diaspora, and people are really still trying to grasp with it. So they're trying to show that this is a very immature concept and it's not yet come to any sort of fruition. So yeah, so CBC really, after watching this for probably like the 10th time, has showcased the bias that they have. And kind of like what we said in the beginning of the intro, we feel that CBC has obviously their own inherent agenda in terms of as a media company with coverage on this kind of stuff. But this also harks back to how Canada has viewed Sikhs as a whole since many have immigrated to the country. And because we don't fit the mold, because we don't fit the narrative of what is Canadian, we are consistently just kind of put in this box out to the side, and we'll be labeled as Canadian whenever it's beneficial to the wider majority. But if we don't stay in that box, then we're fringe, we're fringe, we're fundamentalists, we're extremists. But anyways, that was that's the whole spiel from CBC and our responses to kind of some of the points that they were making. I hope this helps anybody that was looking for a bit more context and clarification to this, and specifically the topics that they discuss in here. I think this is something that we want to do a little bit more of. Just finding the time to kind of sit down and do this sort of stuff is really the kicker. But I think, at least for speaking for myself, I got to step up the game and keep pushing and get a bit more involved with this sort of stuff so that we can have a outlet or voice within these sort of conversations. If you guys got something out of this, just let me know. We appreciate the feedback. And Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.